Center called The Prophet Muhammad and the Model of Shariah Pluralism. We are very happy to have Dr. Jonathan Brown here to speak with us tonight, but before that, I'd like to thank all our co-sponsors, the Center for South Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Illinois, the Muslim Students Association at the University of Illinois, the Muslim Students Association at Parkland College, and the First Mennonite Church of Champaign-Urbana. And just before getting started, just a few housekeeping notes. You should have been handed a survey when you were handing in, hopefully, a feedback form. This is because we're hoping to sponsor the Central Illinois Mosque and Islamic Center is hoping to sponsor more events like this in the near future, and your feedback is very useful to us in order to make sure to find out what we did well, what we didn't do well, so we can improve the events in the future.
Be generous.
And then just to let you know, the general format will be a formal talk followed by question and answer, so please do think about, if you have any questions, write them down, think about them. We are going to have a proper question and answer session at the end. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Irfan Ahmad, the Director of the Outreach Committee at the Central Illinois Mosque and Islamic Center and a member of the faculty here at the University of Illinois in order to make some introductory remarks.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum and good evening to everyone. I just wanted to thank you all for coming on behalf of the Central Illinois Mosque and Islamic Center Outreach Committee, which is organizing these talks, and have been doing that for a number of years, since about 25 years or so, as a beacon of being a community resource that the Central Illinois Mosque and Islamic Center is. And so, as part of these prophetic response series, we had initiated these talks to engage the general community, excuse me, and to have intellectual engagement with the rest of the community. And so this would be our third event or the second plus one event, and we'll continue to do that. I would now invite Professor Valerie Hoffman, who is a professor of Islamic Studies here at the University of Illinois and Director of Center for South Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, to introduce our speaker, Jonathan Brown.
Thank you, Irfan. It is a great pleasure to be invited to introduce Professor Jonathan Brown, and I would just really like to thank CIMIC for taking the initiative to organize an event like this and have a scholar of his caliber come, so thank you. Jonathan Brown is Associate Professor of Islamic Studies and Muslim Christian Understanding and is Associate Director of the Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim Christian Understanding in the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Such a long title. He received his PhD in Islamic thought from the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago in 2006, just a little bit after I did. And Dr. Brown has studied and conducted research in a number of countries, including Egypt, Syria, Turkey, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Indonesia, India, and Iran. And he is a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He is the author of The Canonization of Al-Bukhari and Muslim, The Formation and Function of the Sunni Hadith Canon, published by Brill in 2007. And Hadith, Muhammad's Legacy in the Medieval and Modern World, published by One World Publications in 2009. And Muhammad, A Very Short Introduction, published by Oxford University Press in 2011. And he is also the author of Misquoting Muhammad, to be published by Oxford University Press. In addition to these books, he has published articles in the fields of Hadith, Islamic Law, Sufism, Arabic lexical theory, and pre-Islamic poetry. And he is the editor-in-chief of the Oxford Encyclopedia of Islamic Law. Dr. Brown's current research interests include the history of forgery and historical criticism in Islamic civilization, and modern conflicts between late Sunni traditionalism and Salafism in Islamic thought. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jonathan Brown.
Thank you. Is this working?
Yes.
Thank you very much, the university, for inviting me. Thanks, Professor Ahmed, for taking the time and effort to coordinate this. It's an honor to be here with people like Professor Hoffman, whose articles I read in graduate school and used in my dissertation, and to be also here at a place for me which is sort of a kind of mothership, I guess, because this is where the MSA was founded, and when I was in college and when I became Muslim, the first place I went was MSA, and that's where I met my first Muslim friends, and they took very good care of me and provided a wonderful environment, and I've had nothing but fond feelings and a commitment to the MSA. Wherever I end up being, whichever university I'm at, I always make sure to work with the students. I'm always so impressed by the Muslim students wherever I go. They're always so much initiative and so talented, and they do such a good job representing their religion and taking care of their fellow students and educating the university at large. I also see Sven. Hi, Sven. He was there probably around that time. So I want to first ask you, is this the Heartland? Are we in the Heartland?
Yes.
No?
Yes.
I'm going to say yes. I got to say yes. We're in the Heartland. That's good, because I'm going to ask you, questions. I want you to answer as representative. I want you to answer as representative Americans. Ask you theoretical questions. So let's say I belong to a religion, and in this religion, this unusual religion, I have to dye my hair purple, really bright purple. Does that bother you? Does not bother you. Okay. Why does it not bother you?
Because mine is all one.
Why does it not bother you?
Dye mine.
Huh?
As long as you don't try to make me.
As long as I don't try to make you dye yours. Okay. Now, I have a family. I have a couple of kids and a wife, and I raise them to dye their hair too. Dye their hair purple. Is that okay?
Yep.
Okay. I teach my children, because this is the tenet of my religion, as revealed in the great book of purple hair, descended from on high. Okay. I teach my children that other people who don't dye their hair purple they're misguided, and they are going to hell. Okay?
No.
Does anyone is that okay with people?
No.
It's not okay. Why is it not okay?
Yes, it's okay.
You don't get to decide.
I don't get to decide. Yes.
I don't think you're being instructed that way are going to treat other thinking people very respectfully.
Okay, so the children, if instructed like that, are not going to treat other people very respectfully. Thank God. I was so nervous that my little experiment here would yield results that were going to go against my thesis. But it turns out they fit in perfectly with my plan. Everything is going perfectly so far. As long as they don't pass out, things will be fine. This is interesting. This is an interesting idea. I would venture to say that it is widely accepted in the United States, not by everybody, but it is widely accepted in the United States, that people are free to have their own beliefs, provided they don't force their beliefs on others. Okay? And I would also say, provided that they do not believe or teach that those beliefs that distinguish us one from the other, or that one person may have and another person may not have, that these beliefs don't define our value in the world. Right? That whatever our differences in beliefs, we always have to acknowledge each other's value, each other's worth. And I would go so far as to say, and I think that I've been buttressed in this by the comments from the audience, that it is probably not ideal to believe that other people are really completely wrong to the point that they are going to some awful place after they die. Right? That really believing that other people's beliefs are completely wrong to the point that they're condemned to hellfire this is something that we find unhelpful, possibly unacceptable in our society.
We're academics.
You agree?
As long as we're academics.
As long as we're academics?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll take that as a compliment. Then, basically, we might disagree with each other, but we affirm each other's overall, the value of each other's beliefs. I don't agree with your religion, but I see that it's a good religion, it makes sense. You know, I affirm your religion. That we're not required just to tolerate each other in the United States, but we are actually required to affirm each other's beliefs. Would you agree with me? No. So, but if we say that if I teach you that, if I teach my children that anybody who doesn't dye their hair purple, they're going to hell.
It depends on what you teach them about how they're supposed to treat people who are going to hell.
Very good. Excellent. Okay. So, the United States is a diverse place. The gentleman over here slightly jumped the gun, but it's okay. Because I was watching, we all know it's, there's been a revolution in Egypt that's been going on for the past 18 months or so, right? And I was watching something on Egyptian television, and it was very interesting. It made me think a lot. It was there was a panel with a couple of Coptic priests, so Christian priests, and there was a Salafi, so a kind of very conservative Muslim leader, who was also on this panel. And the Coptic priests were very upset at the conservative Muslim leader because they said, they said to this conservative Muslim leader, you teach other people that we're unbelievers, that we're going to hell. And the conservative Muslim leader said, yes, I do. Because the Quran says that those people who deny the prophethood of Muhammad are unbelievers. And these people, according to the Quran, can expect a difficult fate, right? And the Christian leaders were very upset by this. And people were calling in, Egyptians were calling in and saying, we're upset by this, we don't want other Egyptians treated like this, we don't accept the idea that an Egyptian would go to another Egyptian and say, you're an unbeliever. And what did the conservative Muslim leader say? He said something which I had really never thought about. I feel kind of silly, but it really made me think. He said, of course I don't agree with your religion, and you don't agree with my religion. You also think I'm going to hell, because I don't believe in Jesus Christ and the Christian religion. But what does that have to do with how we treat one another? This has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not I'm nice to you or not nice to you. And the fact that I believe that your religion is wrong, or the fact that I believe that you're misguided, or the fact that I believe you're going to hell, doesn't mean that I'm going to hurt you, doesn't mean that I'm going to take your property, doesn't mean I'm going to be rude to you. And I realized that here was a kind of another model for how we think about pluralism, how we think about different groups in society. In the United States, and in Western Europe as well, there's a very strong idea, not exclusive, there's a very strong theme in society, which is that people have to love one another. People have to respect one another. People have to respect one another's beliefs. People have to be tolerant. People don't want to judge other people. I think these are all, these ideas are probably very familiar to you. But this also has an interesting consequence, which means that we maybe have to pretend we agree with people when we don't. We have to pretend we affirm other people's beliefs when in fact we don't. We have to pretend that we all share the same core beliefs when in fact we might not. So the model that this conservative Muslim scholar was proposing was a model that's not based on shared beliefs. It's based on saying, listen, we totally disagree with each other. But beliefs have nothing to do with the way you treat one another. Because society isn't based on loving each other or agreeing with each other. Society is based on rules that people follow. Society is based on shared notions of obligations, shared notions of rights. So one of the priests got very upset at the Muslim scholar. He said, you don't love me. And the Muslim scholar said, you're right, I don't love you. I don't know you. And I also don't love the guy who sells me bread in the morning. And I don't love the person who's driving the bus. And I don't love the person that I go and buy mobile phone minutes when I recharge my phone. But it doesn't mean that I'm going to go and steal the mobile phone minutes from his store or grab the wheel of the bus and drive it into a bridge embankment or something like that. And I'm not going to go and sneak and take the bread away from the man who's selling it to me in the morning. Our interactions with each other are not based on whether we love each other or not. Our interactions are based on rules of society. And so I thought to myself, that's really interesting. How did this idea come up that love is part of social interaction? Because I think to myself, I don't really love most of the people I interact with either. If I don't know them. And if I do know them, sometimes I don't like them. So when we talk about different models of pluralistic societies, we have maybe one model which is based on the idea of mutual respect for each other's beliefs, affirmation of each other's beliefs. And core to this idea, as this gentleman here brought up very insightfully, is the idea that if we don't respect each other's beliefs, that is going to lead to mistreatment. That if we don't respect each other's beliefs, if I really teach my children that everybody who doesn't dye their hair purple is going to hell, that is somehow going to create a society that none of us want to live in. It's going to create a society filled with hatred. It's going to create a society in which people mistreat each other. And so the urge to create respect between different systems of belief, the urge to have people try and erase these differences, is really driven by the goal or by the desire to live in a society that is peaceful, prosperous, not rancorous. The other model, which is being proposed by this conservative Muslim scholar, is that it's foolish to pretend that different religions are going to agree with each other all the time. If you take two religions and force them to erase the differences between the two, you end up with one religion. You don't end up with two religions anymore. And if people believe, if some people at least believe, that having a distinct religious community, having your distinct religious tradition that you believe is right, and that you're going to cling to, if people believe that that is good, that that's important in life, then they don't want to erase the distinctions between religions. They don't want to live in a world where everybody agrees all the time. Because that's a world where no tradition exists that makes claims to transcendent truth. So, what I'm going to talk to you about is about the kind of Islamic model, which is actually very close to what this somewhat unpopular conservative Muslim scholar was saying. It's a model that is based on recognition of rights, responsibilities, obligations that exist between people in society, that connect people in society regardless of what those people's beliefs are. And we could go back and look at Islamic law, we could look at the history of Islamic civilization, and I'll look at a few examples for that, but I think it's really easiest to go back and look at the life of the Prophet Muhammad, the founder of Islam. So I'll give you examples from his life. When we talk about this issue of treating each other respectfully, how can we live in a society where people disagree with each other completely on core issues of identity, about right and wrong, about truth and falsehood, about whether there's a God or not? How can you have such a society in which people also treat each other respectfully? The Prophet Muhammad taught his followers very clearly that rights and obligations exist regardless of these disagreements. So in one saying of the Prophet Muhammad, for those of you who don't know, Muslims usually don't call Muhammad Muhammad. They call their brother Muhammad because that's probably his name. But they usually call The Prophet Muhammad, they call him the prophet or the messenger of God. So I'll refer to him as the prophet. That's what I'm speaking about. He said, there's three kinds of neighbors. There are three kinds of neighbors. There's a neighbor who has one right. He has one right. And this is the polytheist neighbor. This is the neighbor who worships idols, or who worships a religion, who follows a religion that's not a monotheistic religion. Okay? He has the right of a neighbor. We'll talk later about what that is. He has the right of a neighbor. There's another neighbor who has two rights. Haqqan in Arabic. Two rights. The right of being a neighbor and the right of being Muslim, because this is your Muslim neighbor. There's another neighbor who has three rights. This is a neighbor who is your neighbor. He's Muslim or she's Muslim, and this person's also your relative. So they have the right of a Muslim, they have the right of a neighbor, and they have the right of kin. And just to describe a little about how Muslim scholars in the past understood the notion of a neighbor, some Muslim scholars said that it was everybody from 40 houses down. 40 houses away from your house in every direction. It's a lot of houses. It's a big neighborhood. Or it's all the people who hear the same call to prayer from the mosque. All those people are your neighbor. So what are a neighbor's rights? What are the rights of a neighbor in Islam? Again, a saying from the Prophet Muhammad explains this. The right, and I'm translating, I'll read it to you in Arabic, but you're bored, those of you who don't know Arabic, to death. I will translate it. The right of a neighbor is if he becomes sick, you visit him. And this could also, I'm going to say he, but it could be she too. If this person becomes sick, you visit them. If they die, you console their family. If they ask you for a loan, you give them money. If they become destitute and in need, you help meet their needs. If something good happens to them, you congratulate them. If something bad happens to them, you console them. Don't raise your house up, like build more floors on your house, so that it blocks the wind from getting into their house. And don't cook some tasty food where the smell of your food is drifting into their house, unless you go and offer them some of the food. Right? Those of you who live in the dorm may face this problem from time to time when your neighbor's cooking some especially tasty ramen. People still eat ramen in college? Yeah. Okay, is that what they call it? I lived on that. So this is very interesting. Now, I don't even know my neighbor's name. I don't know any of my neighbor's names. When we had this horrible windstorm in the summer in Washington, D.C., this is the first time any of us ever saw each other. And in one case, it was because the neighbor behind me called the police several times because they thought my generator was too loud. Instead of coming and saying, can you turn down the generator, they actually called the police twice, 2 days in a row. And the police didn't do anything. But I mean, this is a typical unfortunate example of American suburban life, where instead of, God forbid, actually confronting your neighbor and saying, hey buddy, can you turn the generator down, you call the police and have the municipality charge thousands of dollars to send them over. So this right of the neighbor is extensive. I think you would all agree, this is extensive rights that the neighbor enjoys. They get food, money, consolation, congratulation. Their house doesn't get obstructed by a part of your house. This is the right of any neighbor. This is the right of a Muslim neighbor. This is the right of a non-Muslim neighbor. This is the right of a neighbor who's going to hell. This is the right of a neighbor who's going to heaven. And this is in addition to the rights that they would have as a fellow Muslim, that the rights that they would have as your kinsman. And just to give you another idea, the Prophet said in another saying, by God, none of you believes fully until he wants for his neighbor what he wants for himself. Okay, what about, we've talked about neighborly rights and kindness. What about how we actually interact with each other in society? What about transactions and trade? It's interesting, the Prophet Muhammad, this is the city of Medina. This is actually the mosque in which the Prophet is buried in Medina in Saudi Arabia. And this is the graveyard of the Muslims right outside the mosque. And this actually is an area, part of the city of Medina. Sorry, the bottom of the picture is a little gritty, but these are palm trees in Medina. There were at least, when the Prophet arrived in Medina in 622 of the Common Era, at least half the population of the city was Jewish. So the Prophet's community, the Medinan community, was at least half Jewish for many years. And when the Prophet came there, they came to an agreement that all the tribes of the city, whether they're Muslim or pagan, Arab, or Jewish, they would all make war together, make peace together, and that they would all take any problems they have and the Prophet Muhammad would adjudicate them. They borrowed and traded with each other all the time. In fact, when the Prophet died, he had actually borrowed food from, I mean, this was the situation he was in. He had borrowed food from a Jewish member of the Medinan community, and actually had left a suit of armor with that family, with that Jewish family, as collateral. So they're lending and borrowing with each other. In fact, even in some of the wars that the Muslims fought, they enlisted the help of non-Muslims. So when the Muslims retook the city of Mecca, from which they'd been driven years earlier by the oppressive tribe that ruled Mecca, when they took back Mecca, their enemies fought another battle against them. In order to meet those enemies, they needed money. And the Prophet actually borrowed a significant amount of money from someone who was not Muslim at all, who was actually a pagan, who was a polytheist, who worshipped idols. So there was not a problem in dealing with them. The Prophet Muhammad, during his lifetime, actually concluded treaties and agreements with every kind of person. The Muslims, when the teachings of Islam were being developed in Mecca, the Muslims were oppressed by the Meccan elites who did not like the idea of a monotheistic religion. So a number of the Muslims, over 80 Muslims, went and sought refuge in Ethiopia, across the Red Sea. And they sought refuge with the Christian king of Ethiopia, who was known for his just policies, and the Muslims knew they would be treated well. And they were treated well, and they stayed there for several years. So Muslims actually went and sought refuge with non-Muslims. The importance of treaties was supreme with Muslims. So the Prophet Muhammad had treaties with Jewish tribes, he had treaties with Christian cities, he had treaties with polytheist Arabs. And in fact, treaties were so important that they even trumped one's duty to help fellow Muslims. And a famous example of this is when the Muslims were going out to fight their enemies at a battle called Badr, the first big battle between the Meccans and the Muslims and their Meccan enemies. The first big battle in the year 624, the Common Era. The one Muslim named Hudayfa bin Yaman went out to try and join up with the other Muslims to fight in the battle. And he was intercepted by some of the Meccan enemies. And they said, "Are you going to fight with Muhammad?" He said, "Yes, I was going to do that, but now I'm actually going to go back to Medina." And they said, "Okay, go back to Medina." And he went back to Medina. And they said, "We'll take your word on this." And he said, "Yes, I will not go and fight. I'm going back to Medina." So he went back to Medina, and on the way he met the Prophet and the Muslims who were actually going out to the battlefield. And he told the Prophet Muhammad what happened. And he said, "Okay, you've given them your word, go back to Medina." By the way, the Muslims were outnumbered 3-1 in this battle. Every last man, every additional man would have been useful. But the Prophet Muhammad sent Hudayfa back to Medina because he had given his word not to fight. What about things that are more spiritual, more existentially important, like affirming the value of a person who's not Muslim's life, affirming the life of a non-Muslim. Muslims also did this, doing the life of the Prophet. So, after the Prophet died, the Muslim armies expanded out of the Arabian Peninsula. And in one battle, after the battle was over, there was one of the enemy was carrying one of their dead soldiers away. And two of the Muslims, as they were carrying the body by, they stood up for the body as it passed by. And another Muslim said, this person's not Muslim. This person's in fact Zoroastrian, the Persian religion. They're Zoroastrian. They're not Muslim. And the two Muslims who stood up said, we were with the Prophet Muhammad, and a Jewish person's funeral passed by. A Jewish person had died. And the Prophet stood up for that. And we said, why are you standing, O Prophet of God? And he said, Alaysat bi nafs? Is this not a soul? Is this not one of the souls given by God? There's also respect for religious traditions taught by the Prophet Muhammad. Now, this doesn't mean that Muslims agree with everybody's religion. This doesn't mean that the Prophet Muhammad agreed with everybody's religion. He built his religion, he began his teachings to correct what he felt were incorrect religious practices and ideas around him. But that doesn't mean that he didn't recognize the value of those traditions to their own adherents. And in one case, when the Muslims captured a Jewish city called Khaybar, I think I might have some shoes nearby. Oh, those are camels, by the way. Those are camels for milking, not for eating. Camel milk, very good. Roadside camel milk. This, I forgot. The place would have looked like this, but it's not this place. When the Muslims captured this city, they found a huge stash of Jewish texts, of old Jewish texts written in Syriac and Hebrew, and they kept them. And years later, when some Jewish envoys came to visit the Prophet, they returned these texts to them. They kept them for them. They didn't destroy them, they didn't desecrate them, say this is from a religion that we don't accept. When Christians from this city, this is the city of Najran. Najran is right now right on the border between Saudi Arabia and Yemen, southern Arabia. City of Najran. There's old houses in the city of Najran. When Christians from the city of Najran came to visit the Prophet, a delegation of them to basically make a treaty with him, which they did. When the time came for them to pray, for the Christians to pray, the Prophet Muhammad instructed all the Muslims to leave the mosque, to go outside, and allowed the Christians to conduct their prayer in the mosque. So if these communities are living side by side in a place like Medina, where you have Jews and Muslims and polytheist Arabs all living together, how do they adjudicate their disputes? It's easy to talk about people getting along or respecting one another's rights, but what happens when people disagree over what those rights are? In the case of Medina, in the case of Arabia at the time of the Prophet, there was actually a shared culture. The Jewish Arabs, I know that sounds kind of like contradiction, but Jewish Arabs, the Muslim Arabs, and the polytheist Arabs, they all share the same culture. They all share the same notions of what justice is. And justice in Arabic is adl, or adala. Adl is from the same root as idl. Idl is half a camel load. So you can imagine there's a camel. Wait, that's not the camels. Half a camel, so a camel load is on both sides of their body, and justice is when they're balanced. Right? Otherwise, the camel is going to flop over this side or flop over that side, or the load's going to fall off. So justice actually comes from the same root as these half of a camel load. So justice is equity. Justice was, in the time of the Prophet, everybody getting what their due is. Everybody getting their due. Everybody getting their due. And in fact, oftentimes, the Quran, the Muslim holy book, it doesn't often go into the details of what right and wrong are. Instead, it says, God commands you to be just and to be good. When it talks about marriage, it says either stay married according to what's right, or send your spouse away, divorce your spouse with goodness. These terms, they're not, you can imagine what's right and what's good in one place is different from what's right and what's good in another place. What's right and what's good in one situation could be different from what's right and what's good in another situation. Now, this doesn't mean that in Islam, Muslims believe that what's right and what's good is dependent on where you live. So for example, Muslims believe that it's always wrong to drink alcohol. It's always wrong to get drunk. That doesn't matter if in your society it's normal or not. In America, it's completely normal to drink alcohol, completely normal to get, maybe not totally drunk, but it's a little bit tipsy. Okay? This is totally normal. But this doesn't make it right. Because right and wrong for Muslims is defined by those values that were prevalent at the time of the Prophet, the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. That introduces the challenge of figuring out how these values should be understood and implemented in other societies, and that's the great challenge that Muslim scholars have faced throughout history. But we can see how important this notion of justice was at the time of the Prophet. That this notion of justice transcended all the religions. So there was one point when the Prophet was dividing up some of the goods that had been captured in a battle. And this man said to him, "You have perished, Muhammad. You have perished if you are not just in dividing up these spoils." This is very aggressive speech to be directed at the Prophet of God. But he didn't get upset. Because what was this man saying? He's saying, you have to be just in how you divide these things up. The importance of justice and the notion of justice united all the religious groups over which the Prophet ruled in Medina. And there was one instance in which a companion of the Prophet, who was Muslim, came to him and said, I'm disputing with this Jewish person. We're disputing over land. He's taken land from me. This is my land. And the Prophet asked the man for evidence, the Muslim for evidence. Do you have any evidence? No, I am telling you this is what happened. I'm Muslim, and I'm telling you what happened, and he's Jewish, and he took my land. And the Prophet asked the Jewish man, do you swear that you did not take this land? The Jewish man swore, I did not take this. This is my land, originally. The Prophet says, okay. The Jewish man keeps his land. And the Muslim got very upset. He said, how can you rule on behalf of this, for the sake of this Jewish man? And I'm Muslim. But the fact of the matter is that in the procedure of justice at the Prophet time, if you have evidence, evidence beats an oath. But if someone doesn't have any evidence, all the defendant has to do is swear that they're innocent of the charge, and they're cleared of any potential wrongdoing. Doesn't matter what their religion is. And it's actually really interesting that later on in Islamic civilization in Baghdad in the 800s and 900s, Baghdad was a city built by the Muslims in the 760s of the Common Era, you had great Jewish communities and Christian communities in Baghdad. In fact, the two most important centers of Jewish study in the world, of rabbinic study, from the 500s all the way up until the 1000s of the Common Era, were in Baghdad. The academies of Suru and Pompedita, they were called. Now, many of the Jews and Christians in Baghdad actually ended up going to the Islamic courts in Baghdad, the Sharia courts, in order to register their land, in order to register their marriages. If women wanted to get a divorce, sometimes they'd end up going to the Sharia court to get a divorce instead of going to the rabbinic court. Because, one, The Muslims were the authorities in charge, and if the Muslim judge had a ruling, that ruling could actually be enforced. But two, they trusted the procedure of Muslim courts. And Muslim scholars, Muslim judges in those courts, accepted the evidence. They would sit there and arbitrate between a Jewish man and a Jewish woman over an issue of divorce, or between two Jewish men over an issue of a sale gone bad. So, having discussed this, I would ask you to think about how does this. Now, I earlier asked you as Americans from the Heartland to answer questions. I want you to think about whether or not this, the model of the Prophet Muhammad, whether or not this would meet the requirements of modern American society. Are these two systems compatible? If they're not compatible, why are they not compatible? When we talk about, when I gave you the example of the purple hair dye, I was surprised. Well, this gentleman said I shouldn't make him dye his hair purple. Can I try and convince you to dye your hair purple?
Try.
I can try. But ultimately, I have to respect what? I have to respect your autonomy. Now, I was surprised nobody reacted because I said I have children, and I teach them to dye their hair purple. What happens a few years later? When the children become 18, let's say. What then happens? Do I have the right to still tell them can I still tell them to keep their hair dyed purple?
No. Tell them.
What do we assume will happen?
You can tell them, but you can't make them listen.
Of course. So there's this, one of the central ideas, I think, in American liberalism, and I don't mean liberalism as Democrats or Republicans, I mean sort of general American liberal, the polity in which we live. The idea that there's no metaphysical claim that runs our society. We all sort of try and make arguments about what's right and what's wrong based on evidence that we all accept. One of the important ideas is autonomy. That individuals have to make their own decisions about religion. That nobody can make a decision for somebody else. This is obviously I think a central core. And what this causes is that one of the things that Americans generally tend to object to in other countries are things like controls over religion. Somebody saying that somebody can't change their religion or can't have a certain religion or can't practice a certain religion or can't preach a certain religion. Now in the Islamic tradition, apostasy, or leaving Islam, if a Muslim abandons Islam, this is historically in Islamic civilization been a very serious offense. This has been considered by most Muslim scholars to be, in fact, a capital offense. Now, this seems to be a major point of non-compatibility with American political ideas. But it's very interesting because there's also some examples from the life of the Prophet which give us a slightly different picture. When the Prophet was in the city of Medina, which he ruled as basically the chief of the city, a man came from Mecca who became Muslim. His name was Abdullah ibn Sa'd. He became Muslim, and he actually became one of the scribes of the Prophet, so he would write the Prophet's messages and things because the Prophet Muhammad was illiterate. And eventually he decided he didn't like Islam anymore, and he went back to Mecca. He abandoned Islam. He said, I'm not Muslim anymore. He went back to Mecca. He wrote nasty poetry insulting Muslims and insulting the Prophet. Later on, he became Muslim again. And in fact, after the Muslims conquered Egypt, he was made the governor of Egypt. This does not seem to concur with the apostasy as a death penalty offense narrative that I just gave you. Not only did he apostatize, but he became an enemy agent against the Muslims. And later on, not only was he accepted back into Islam, but he was made a governor of a major province. This is very interesting. During the life of the Prophet, and during the early years of the Muslim community, I can't think of any person who was actually killed for leaving Islam. And this is because the way that people understood apostasy was more a matter of allegiance to a state or to a community than about personal conscience. In fact, Muslim scholars throughout Islamic history generally didn't care what people actually believed in their hearts. They didn't care what they did in their homes. They didn't care whether they were sincere in their prayers or whether they sat at home and drank alcohol. It didn't matter. What mattered was your public behavior. If you came out and were criticizing the Prophet Muhammad, insulting him, insulting the Quran, insulting Islam, trying to rile people up against their religion, this was a major offense for Muslim scholars. Because they saw this as a threat to their order, to their polity. It wasn't a matter of personal conscience. So this has led many Muslim scholars in the modern period, Muslim scholars today, and I'll give you some names, very influential scholars like Yusuf al-Qaradawi, like Sheikh Ali Jum'ah, the Mufti of Egypt, and others, to say that we have to distinguish now in a world where allegiance isn't to a religion. If you lived in medieval Europe in the 1200s, you belong to Christendom. You're a Christian, first and foremost. If you lived in the Muslim world in, let's say, Syria in 1300, your identity was a Muslim. You lived in the abode of Islam. That was the chief polity to which you belonged. And leaving that religion was almost an act of treason to that polity. Now we don't live in a world like that. Now we live in a world in which religion is a private matter, in which one's loyalty is, or one's identity is determined mostly by your nation state, maybe by your city or by your culture. And in this case, there's no reason to treat apostasy so severely. So in a lot of ways, the apostasy that Muslim scholars considered so dangerous is more similar to maybe high treason today. Now, I'm eager to hear your thoughts on whether or not you think the model that I described is incompatible, compatible, semi-compatible with what maybe Americans expect or what Americans want, and where you think the differences are. I'm eager to hear that, and I'll also answer any other questions you might have. Thank you.
Yes, so we can start taking questions now. Some show of hands. Good. If you can speak up, or I can pass the microphone.
Yeah, I can just speak up. I'm curious. There are a lot of groups, particularly the Wahhabis of Saudi Arabia. How would you feel that they would take an approach to a more classical understanding of Muslim Judeo-Christian relations, particularly in a more modern light, as opposed to a classical light?
I'm curious, what did you think of remember the scholar I told you about with the two priests on TV? Remember, were you here for that?
Yeah.
What did you think about what he was saying? Was it on a crazyometer, like 10 or 1? 1 being not crazy, 10 being totally insane.
He seemed like a very progressive in terms of relations, but not very progressive in terms of his understanding of the faith. So I'm more interested in how you think that would revolve within the understanding of current Wahhabis.
Okay, well that scholar is a Wahhabi scholar. So that would be the position of Wahhabi scholar on interfaith relations, in the sense of actually how we relate to one another practically. In terms of faith, there are some Muslim scholars who argue that other religions are that somebody can follow and someone can learn about Islam. Let me back up. So if somebody doesn't know anything about Islam, if they live off in the mountains of Peru or something, they ever heard of Islam, they're not held accountable. For Muslims, God will judge them on the Day of Judgment. We don't know what's going to happen to that person. But they're certainly not going to be held accountable for not being Muslim because they didn't know what Islam was. If they live in, let's say, a city in the middle of the United States and they never meet Muslims, and the only Muslim they meet is some really horrible alcoholic guy who's always beating people up at a bar, okay? And all they see about Islam is, 9/11 and terrorism this and terrorism that. They're also not held accountable for rejecting Islam because they had absolutely no reason to become Muslim. Why would someone become Muslim if this is what they knew about the religion? They have not been communicated the religion in the proper way, in a reliable way. However, if somebody learns about Islam in the proper way, they understand the religion, and if they still choose not to accept that religion, whether or not they pray or not, it doesn't matter. What they say or not doesn't matter. But in their heart, if they don't accept their religion, then according to all Orthodox Muslim scholars that I know, all Muslim scholars, serious Muslim scholars, would say that person will be punished by God on the Day of Judgment, probably with hellfire. Now, God can forgive. It's totally up to God. God can forgive that person, or this is not in our ability to judge. But we would, as a Muslim scholar, would say this person is an unbeliever. So, when you say a more progressive approach to faith, the vast majority of Muslim scholars aren't of the school of thought that there's some inherent good in erasing the differences between religious traditions. If someone says, I believe that Muhammad is not a prophet, I don't accept his promise, Muslim scholar can't accept this person as they can't. That's a rejection of the message of Islam. If that person says, I believe that Jesus is the Son of God, that God actually had a son, this is a big theological problem for Muslim scholars. They can't accept that. What's going to happen to this person in the afterlife? God knows. No human being knows. But there's not really a way to accept that belief as valid. Now, a minority of Muslim scholars argue that, well, let's look behind what the particularities of a religious tradition, and let's look for common notions of truth. So in that case, for example, in Hinduism, if you look at on the surface, there is not much of you can't get much more different than Islam, where you can't portray God in any way whatsoever or worship any idols, and Hinduism, or the Hindu religious families, where there's lots of portrayals of God, and 1 million, or 10, 20, 30, 40, 100,000 different gods, seem to be totally opposed to one. But if you look behind those particularities, you see significant similarities, right? Why do Muslims not portray God? Because they believe God is too great to be portrayed. Why do Hindus create idols? Because God is too great to be portrayed. Brahman, the idea of the divine force in the world, is too great to be portrayed. Nothing you do can possibly portray this force. So whatever you do, have a guy with a pitchfork, or have a person whose skin is blue, or have a monkey, or an elephant. It doesn't matter. None of these things, any attempt to portray God is as silly as any other attempt. None of them can possibly portray the divine force in the world. And that's why, Hindu saints in the medieval period, one saint was asked by his students, how many gods are there? And he said, I can't remember the exact number, like 100,000. And the student said, no, tell me, please, how many gods really are there? He said, 200,000. How many gods really are there? 300,000. It doesn't matter, because these things are all just imperfect reflections of the divine reality. So some Muslim scholars, this is a small minority, would argue for looking beyond the particularities at core similarities. I know that's a long answer, sorry about that. To the back.
Yeah, throughout the lecture we were discussing some interactions that were practical or non-religious. But I just wanted to question, on what basis are these interactions? You said there's a common ground. It's almost vague, very vague. What common grounds are there? Because as Muslims, is everything derived from our religion, or at least in this society, everything's derived from law, the Constitution and whatnot. Is that necessarily compatible with Islam? Because if that were the case, then our religion wouldn't necessarily be Islam. It would be secularism, where we believe in these, almost third-party actor gods, which don't have much control over anything in our society. What do you think of?
Well, I mean, that's interesting. Well, do you really think our interactions with each other are based on law in the United States?
Yeah, it seems to be.
I mean, how many times have you been to court?
It seems to be based on common laws and things that are given.
It's based on what's called urf in Arabic, on custom. I mean, I've thank God I've never been to court. Yes, I've never been to court.
Are you married?
Yeah. Oh, is that a court?
If you're married, then that has.
I wasn't in court. It was some other
It's
room.
because of the legal institution of marriage that you enjoy the rights of being married, not because of whatever you might believe about marriage.
The rights of being married, like tax rights?
Whatever they may be. Whatever those rights are in our society, they're because they're.
No, okay, but
law,
certain rights I enjoy. I enjoy because I have a Sharia marriage with 2 witnesses. It's acceptable in Islam. Other rights, like tax deductions and things like that, I get because I'm married in the court. So my point is that our interactions with each other in the United States are mostly based on custom.
Well, then custom would be the dictating force. So then, are we saying that custom is a dictating force, which is superior to a religion? Or?
No, okay. In Islamic law, there's 5 core, it's called maxims, 5 juridical maxims that are kind of govern the way that Muslim scholars, legal scholars think about law. One of them is al-'ada muhakkama. Custom is supreme. Custom rules all. What does that mean? That doesn't mean that custom makes everything right. Like I said before, there's no situation, unless you're dying of thirst in the desert and you come across, a mini bar that's fallen out of an airplane full of little bottles of vodka, right? Anything besides that situation, you can't drink alcohol. It's a sin to drink alcohol. It's a sin to get drunk. Doesn't matter what custom is. So there's certain things that are prohibited or required by the Prophet's injunctions or by the Quran. Aside from that, however, things are governed by custom, even in Islamic law. So let's say in most schools of Islamic law, if we're conducting I forgot your name. Nabil. Nabil and I are conducting a transaction. Nabil is selling me this roll of tape. Thank you. And we conduct the transaction. We are allowed, either of us are allowed to rescind or cancel this transaction until we part company. Until we part company. What does parting company mean? Does that mean the end of the working day? Does that mean when I walk away? What if we're walking in a market and this is a mall and I walk away to another stall and then I come back? Am I still allowed to void this transaction? So like return policies, right? This is based on custom. Depends on what country you're in. So much of Islamic law, when I got married, okay, Muslim men have to pay their wife a dowry, a bride price. They have to give their wife money or something. Even if it's a pen, they have to give them something, right? And my wife was not going to accept a pen, so I had to give her more than a pen. So you have to give your wife. How is this determined? This is determined also by custom. What is the custom in your country or your community, in your social class even?
But I wouldn't say that that's it's not. I don't think that these things are based necessarily on customs like the return policy. I think it's solely derived from the notion of justice, something heavily ingrained in Islam. Just because it happens to align itself with our current customs, I don't think that necessarily means it's derived from some
what's justice? How do you define what justice is? Justice is defined differently from time to time and place to place. And to the extent that Islamic law is determined by custom, and much of it is, local notions of justice will determine that. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say that. I'm not trying to pretend that Islamic law is no, it's okay. Just do whatever you want, wherever you are. It's okay. I'm not trying to say that. There's some very, very firm rules in Islamic law. There's very firm rules. Okay, but around those rules, between those rules, in the details of those rules, these things are determined by custom and determined by notions of justice that are determined by custom.
All right.
Yes. Okay. Sorry.
My question is that you gave a model of pretty much the Christian, Judaism, and Muslims pretty much living in the same city, same country, by laws. Do you think it was the case back then because Christians weren't committing adultery, Christians weren't eating pork? Was that the reason that Christians and Muslims were able to?
No, they were
keep
eating.
together?
I mean, they were eating all sorts of stuff that the Muslims couldn't eat. They were drinking wine. The Muslims couldn't drink wine after the 627 or about. They were, and by the way, everybody was committing adultery. I mean, not everybody. There was no community free of adultery. Let me rephrase that. So you have Muslims also committed adultery sometimes in the life of the Prophet. So I don't think it's based at all on some notion that everybody was better back then or that other religious communities had morals that were closer to Islam. They were in the same culture, so yeah, they agreed with each other a lot more. But in important ways, they disagreed completely. So, Christians could still drink wine after Muslims did. That's a big difference. After Muslims expanded outside Arabia, they dealt with Christian communities where Christians can't have more than one wife, only one wife. Muslim men can have up to 4 wives if they treat all of them equally, which is very difficult. Yes?
I had a comment about something that you mentioned earlier, the Salafi man that was talking to the priest and said...
We can't hear here.
Oh, it's okay, I'll repeat the question.
The Salafi man that was talking to the Christian priest in Egypt and saying that, no, I don't love you, but that doesn't mean that there aren't a bunch of obligations that I have to do towards you. And so what I understood is that perhaps you're saying that is perhaps a valid kind of thing to say, that we don't necessarily have to love each other, but as long as we do these obligations fulfill these obligations toward each other. But for me, that seems like we're kind of depriving, these obligations of the spirit. I mean, we listed a bunch of things that we owe our neighbors, to share happiness with them, to ask about them when they're sick, to help them out when they need help. Isn't that ultimately supposed to lead us to loving our neighbors? I mean, what's the point of doing all these things if we don't really love them? And what is the point of, the neighbor, the person who's receiving these acts, how is he supposed to appreciate those things if they don't have love?
This is a very good question. Excellent question. The question was, there's this model given by this Salafi scholar, Wahhabi scholar, about rights and obligations we have towards one another. But why? But if we're just doing these things because they're rights and obligations, aren't we kind of emptying them of any spirit, of any moral spirit? And aren't we kind of empty people in a way? And why is this neighbor even, what's the point of all this if we're not pursuing the ultimate aim of loving one another? This is a good question. But I would ask you, and I ask myself this question a lot, so I don't have the answer. But I will try to assist you in the way I've tried to develop my own thoughts on the issue, which is that, one, why are we assuming that the ultimate goal is to love one another? I mean, this seems like a fair assumption because it's the predominant assumption in our society. Right? I mean, I was at least culturally Christian for most of my life, and those reasons resonate very strongly with me, as I think they do with many people in America, because this is something that has held out there as a good that should be pursued. But my question is, why is that? Is it really because I'm supposed to love the bus driver or all my professors? I have to love them really as a person? Do I have to get to know them and see the beauty in them? Is that the goal we're really aiming for? Or is the goal we're aiming for a peaceful, prosperous society where people can kind of go about their business, form relationships in the way they want to in a stable way? And I mean, I don't know the answer to the question. I don't know the answer to the question, but I do know that I don't know of a lot of evidence in the Islamic tradition and the core scriptures of the Islamic tradition that would back up what you're arguing for. And then my question would be, if it's not there, and I may be wrong, maybe there is evidence there, but if it's not there, then you either have to accept that or explain why it's not there.
Are you familiar with the hadith of the Prophet where he says, لا يدخل أحدكم الجنة أو well, I mean the second part is ولا تؤمنوا
حتى يحب لأخيه ما يحب لنفسه.
That's not what I was going for. The one is حتى تحابوا and then where he says ألا أدلكم على شيء إن فعلتموه تحاببتم أفشوا السلام بينكم.
What's this حب؟ الحب في إيه والبغض في إيه؟ الحب في الله والبغض في الله. These hadiths are very clear. Love, when the Prophet says loving one another, it's love in God, for God's sake, and dislike for God's sake. Right? So you have to love in God. And if you love your neighbor in God, this is fine. But that's different from loving the person and accepting and loving everything they stand for, loving their beliefs, right?
In the back. Go ahead.
No, she was.
Questions of work, but let's assume that some people that live in a society where the purple hair guy find it offensive to see purple-haired people in the street. Okay. For example, like in France, people were saying that it's very offensive to see covered women. For a lot of Muslims, it may be expensive for people to see, for example, same-sex couples publicly displaying affection, whereas for them, it's a right and it's something that they're doing. So how would we, I'm not really sure how to word this question, but how would we, kind of like put it together if, for example, we have something that's so far where I can't expose my children, for example, to same-sex couples. I don't want to be seeing same-sex couples in public. Whereas for them, as human beings, it's an expression of the self.
I mean, this is a really good question. This is how do you basically, our behaviors affect one another, and if we acknowledge difference in belief and difference in values, at what point are difference in values harming one another? So, yeah.
Because you also mentioned that for a lot of Muslim scholars, it wasn't so much what we did behind closed doors, it's what we did in public, and it's the same thing. Like for an adulterer, if you adulterated and behind closed doors, that was up to you, but if you had full witnesses, then oh my God, it's probably
in trouble
to be punished. Yeah. So it's the same thing with, how do you define what is allowed in public? I mean, we also have the discussion of what's too lewd for public, what's too, wrong for public TV, for daylight television. So how do we reach a level with other big issues like, couple hair and stuff?
I mean, this is a huge issue, right? And the question you're asking is how do societies come up with agreed upon conventions or criteria for determining what is acceptable or not acceptable in public space? Because public space affects everybody. So you could say that one answer could be, let's look at the minimum, the thing that offends nobody, and this is allowed. Anything beyond that is not allowed because somebody's going to get offended. That's one answer. But then somebody could say, wait a second, but I want to show something in public which is so core to my identity that if I'm not allowed to show this in public, this will